Before we begin, I want to tell you about Intimate Judaism's newest project. Tali Rosenbaum and I have just released Intimacy and Sexuality for Emerging Adults, powered by Intimate Judaism, a new 10-part podcast series designed to give young Jewish adults the kind of honest, thoughtful, and Torah-based guidance about relationships, sexuality, and intimacy that too many of them simply aren't getting. We talk about emotional intimacy and vulnerability, dating and physical boundaries, attraction and sexual desire, anatomy and sexual response, consent and communication, pornography, love and marriage, nida and building intimacy within marriage, some of the difficult questions surrounding sexual orientation and Torah, and more. All 10 episodes of Intimacy and Sexuality for Emerging Adults, powered by Intimate Judaism, are available now. Just click on the links in the description of this podcast.
We are carrying two basic identities as a people. The first is we are the children of Avraham Avinu. We are Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, as Jews used to call ourselves, merciful children of merciful parents. And we have carried this tradition for 4,000 years. The second identity that we carry is that we are history's most hated and hunted people. And for the period of the 2,000 years of exile, these two identities were in harmony. But once you transition to power, and you have the responsibility of power in very complicated moral situations, you find suddenly that these two seminal identities, these two identities really help define us as a people. They now come into tension, if not overt conflict.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. For many Jews who care deeply about Israel, the past few years have created a painful tension. We know that Israel is routinely judged unfairly, that much of the criticism directed against it ignores the extraordinary circumstances it faces, that many charges leveled against Israel are absolutely false and libelous, and that some of its loudest critics are not interested in changing Israel, but in delegitimizing it altogether. Context matters, and Israel cannot be judged honestly without taking that context seriously. At the same time, loving and supporting Israel does not require us to pretend that Israel always gets everything right, or that every criticism is necessarily unfair. So how do we hold those truths together? How do we defend Israel against accusations that are false or distorted, while remaining willing to confront genuine failures when they occur? And how do we acknowledge disappointment without allowing that disappointment to undermine our commitment to Zionism itself? Yossi Klein Halevi has spent a lifetime thinking about Israel, Zionism, Jewish identity, and the divisions within Israeli society. In this conversation, we discuss that difficult balancing act, the crisis some diaspora Jews are experiencing in their relationship with Israel, the changing face of religious Zionism, and whether a deeply divided Israel can recover a shared sense of purpose and a compelling vision for its future. I also want to give a special thank you to Dr. Blima Marcus, who has been a guest on this podcast before, most recently in episode 161, Helping From Jews Die, What We Need to Know When It's Time to Die. I asked her for suggestions of questions to ask Yossi, and her insights and help were invaluable. We'll get to our conversation in just a moment. First, read my articles by subscribing to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. It's free to join, and you can cancel at any time. If you'd like even more, you can become a member and receive exclusive bonus content with every episode. In our bonus conversation, Yossi reflects on what decades of interfaith dialogue have taught him about his own Judaism. He explains how encountering deeply committed Christians and Muslims changed the way he approaches prayer, religious practice, and his relationship with God. To hear that exclusive discussion and support the podcast, become a member of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. The link is in the description of this podcast. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He is co-host, together with Daniel Hartman, of the Hartman Institute's podcast For Heaven's Sake, the #1 Jewish podcast in the English-speaking world. His 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller and has appeared in a dozen languages. He's currently writing a book about the meaning of Jewish survival. He has written for leading op-ed pages in North America and is a former contributing editor to The New Republic. He is frequently quoted on Israeli, Middle Eastern, and Jewish affairs in leading media around the world and is one of the best-known lecturers on Israeli issues in the North American Jewish community and on North American campuses. From 2013 to 2023, he served as co-director of the Hartman Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, MLI, which taught emerging young Muslim leaders in North America about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Over 150 Muslim leaders participated in the program. Born in Brooklyn, Yossi received his BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and his MS in Journalism from Northwestern University. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, an astrologer. They have 3 children. Yossi Klein Halevi, thank you very much for joining me once again on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Always a pleasure, Scott. Thanks for having me.
The past few years, as we all know, has been a very difficult and painful period. For many reasons, we feel attacked on all sides, militarily, of course, and also in the public sphere. And alongside those attacks, which are often absurd, we also are very often unhappy with the direction that Israelis or Zionists or the state of Israel is going, and the direction it may be going in the future if trends continue. It's not so much that we agree with our detractors as that we wonder if among the unfair criticisms is sometimes a critique that may be fair. That's sort of my introduction to what I want to talk about, this difficult tension that we're all dealing with right now. With that said, let me ask you, Yossi, how has your own relationship with the state of Israel changed since October 7th?
Well, I would have to predate that by a year with the rise of the Netanyahu coalition, a coalition that I would call a coalition of ultras, ultra-nationalist, ultra-Orthodox. I would also throw in ultra-corrupt. I think that the Likud is by far the most corrupt party that we've seen in Israel's history, which is saying something. You know, think about the Labor Party, especially in the last years before Menachem Begin was elected, and I think of Shas. We've had some major political, some first-rate corrupt parties in this country. And yet I think that where Netanyahu has taken the Likud, the culture of the Likud, and the kinds of people he brought in as sycophants, and that was the only measure for Netanyahu of who belongs in the Likud. But most of all, what wounded me so deeply was that not only did this government not care about minimally trying to hold Israeli society together, but it actively sought to tear us apart. We have never had a government whose intention was to tear us apart. You can go back to the Rabin government during the Oslo years, and I was very opposed to the Rabin government in those years and how it, not intentionally, but very consequentially, tore Israel apart, and how it did nothing really to try to heal that divide. Netanyahu has taken this, if anything, to an even worse degree, where he saw it as being politically beneficial to set his base against his opponents. And the level of hatred that we've seen in the streets, the delegitimization, turn on Channel 14, Netanyahu's in-house TV station, and you just can't believe the level of, it's not even vitriol, it's just raw hatred against Jews like me. And so my crisis really began the year before October 7th. In a strange way, Scott, October 7th and the aftermath, the immediate aftermath at least, was a healing experience for me because the country came together in ways that I no longer thought we were capable of. If you had asked me before October 7th, are we going to ever be able to come together again the way we did in May 1967 or October 1973 or 1976 around the Entebbe rescue? Uh, I, I, I don't know if I would have said yes. And I think that we surprised ourselves by our ability to function again as a coherent people. And so, at least in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, the fact that we were all grieving together, the fact that we were all enraged together, the fact that we were all determined to not allow October 7th to stand, that gave me tremendous faith in the future of Israel. And so it's been a very different kind of shattering. The certainly the reaction of the global hostility to Israel was shocking in the sense that it was triggered by a mass murder of Jews. It's like I can't get my head around that. How is it possible that October 7th was the catalyst for the eruption of an unprecedented extent of hatred of Israel, which began before we really started our counterattack in Gaza? And so these are the elements that I'm dealing with. Israeli society, in a strange way, has given me comfort since October 7th.
Well, let me ask, is that still true today? We're almost 3 years past October 7th, and the joining together that happened in the immediate aftermath feels, at least to many of us, that it no longer is practically true.
Yeah.
So do you feel that same sense of comfort, or do you feel that it's falling apart again?
Yeah, I somewhere in between. I think that certainly we haven't maintained the immediate post October 7th solidarity, nor is it possible for any society to maintain that level of intense solidarity. It's just it's not natural. There are such deep divides in this country, and they need to be debated and expressed within limits. But and those limits are that they don't start tearing at the most basic fabric of Israeli society. But I think that there is a majority of Israelis, and you see it in the polls, who don't want to return to pre-October 7th Israel. They don't want to return to the hatred and demonization and the fear of violence. And that fear still hovers. It's still there. And there is a hardcore of Netanyahu supporters who are violent. It's a small minority, but not a negligible minority. And so I'm very much afraid of where we're heading. On the other hand, I think that there is a solid majority here, if not a consensus, that what we need most of all in the coming years is some healing.
Well, one of the things that I find to be really troubling is the very fact that even given that what you say is I agree with, and I think it's true, the nature of Israel's political system is that it contains a fundamental flaw. And we saw this fundamental flaw over the past 6 years, which is that, I mean, there's more than one fundamental flaw. In my opinion, the fact there are no term limits is a fundamental flaw, but I'm talking about something in terms of the way we vote.
There are also some fundamentalist flaws, but we'll put that aside.
That's also true, absolutely. But within the nature of the governing system, right now, if no one could put together a government after the elections, then the result is new elections. The problem is that there's no reason why a new election should have any significant difference from the previous one several months earlier, because it's no longer a referendum on the new government. It'll just be the same thing over and over again, which is what we're seeing. This system only works when the people are not so polarized in such a relatively even division like this, such that it's almost impossible for one group to put together a majority. And what scares me is because of this, that there could be this indefinite over and over repeat of Netanyahu government with a minority continuing to function effectively as a government until someone can put together a majority, which no poll has yet shown anyone able to do.
Yeah. I'm actually more optimistic about the outcome of the election. I think that in that this time around, the energy and the passion belongs to the opposition rather than to the coalition. And many of Netanyahu's supporters have been deeply demoralized by the wholesale surrender to the Haredi agenda, and the billions in handouts, to say nothing of the blanket exemption that this government has tried to push through. And not only could voters serve in the army, their children serve in the army. They're no less outraged about this deeply distorted relationship between the Haredi community and the state as people like me. So I don't know how that will translate. I don't think, there are wild cards here. We have a few more months to elections. This is the first time that you have a serious candidate for prime minister who's Moroccan. It's also the first time you have a serious candidate, happens to be the same guy, who is a bereaved father. It's a very powerful combination. And I don't think that has played itself out yet. And I also think that Netanyahu is very vulnerable. He's making one mistake after another. I follow his campaign, his clips. They're not sharp. There's a desperation. He's relying on old tropes that certainly work for the base, but I don't think it have any possibility of attracting new voters. There are also some wild cards here. There are these small new spoiler parties emerging, and no one knows really how that's going to play out. Will Chili Troper and Yoaz Hendel, they're the Miluimnikim party. Will they cross the threshold? Will Smotrich in the end be punished by his voters who carry a disproportionate burden of security since October 7th? Will they punish him for supporting the Haredi draft agenda? There are real open questions here. Things are fluid. What seems to be solid is that the opposition is not going under 57 seats, and it veers in the polls that I've seen anywhere from 57 to 61. And these other variables, it's really hard to know how it will impact. I tend to feel that the opposition's base is solid, and that is that there are enough people in this country who are outraged by the combination of the lack of accountability for October 7th that this government has insisted on enforcing, along with the wholesale sellout to the Haredim. I think that combination creates a pretty immovable, solid base of support for the opposition. I think the government's base might be a little weaker.
Okay, I hope you're right, because I don't hide the fact that I am not a proponent of the current government or a fan of the current government or Bibi Netanyahu. What's funny is that my kids think that I'm a leftist, and I have no problem with that label, but it's not true. It's just that nowadays, if you don't like Bibi, you're a leftist, and that's sort of the way people are labeled.
To the club. I don't vote left, I vote center. But of course, in Netanyahu's world, center is far left. And anyone who opposes him is a radical leftist. And that's part of, and it's an ingenious device, and it's worked again to solidify his base, but he doesn't go much beyond that 35%, which seems to be with him no matter what. And the truth is, what we've experienced already qualifies under the rubric of no matter what.
And one of the problems, of course, as you say, that 35% sticks with him. The Haredi party stick with them. Smotrich may or may not stick with him, but it seems that they go back and forth between Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and it's hard to know that they'll actually leave. So ultimately, it's almost like shifting deck chairs in the same ship, where the number remains around 50, regardless of which party goes up and which party goes down.
Right.
I'd like to actually move into a different topic right now along the same lines. Not so much what people here, you and I in Israel, are saying about the current government, but the hashvachot, the consequences of the way this government has acted, whether or not they're fair or not fair. But I see people in the United States, for example, and I'm sure other countries too, who are themselves Jewish and care about Israel, and yet they're so disillusioned right now that I'm not going to quite say they've questioned Zionism itself, but they come close to it and question the fact that we have a state of Israel. Is this really appropriate? I believe strongly that many of these critiques are grossly unfair. And I also know that they're not coming from a place that is unfair from their perspective. They're not doing it out of chas v'shalom hatred of Israel. It's not about that. It's coming from severe disillusionment and disappointment. And sometimes some of their critiques are true when we talk about settler violence in the West Bank as an example. Now, I have no idea what's actually happening there because I'm not a journalist. I'm not somebody who has inside information, but I know that some people say, no, it's not nearly as bad as the media report. And other people say, yes, it is, or it doesn't matter. There's still too much and the government isn't doing enough about it. Whatever the truth is, there's something going on there and people are very disillusioned. How would you, Yossi, talk to somebody in the United States, for example, where we're both from originally, who says, I am disillusioned with the state of Israel, not with the government, but with the state of Israel as such? What would you say to them?
My starting point is that you judge Israel within its context, and not by absolute terms. And if you judge Israel by absolute terms, you have a country that's ruling over another people for the last 50 years, that is fighting brutal wars within civilian uh, neighborhoods, resulting in thousands of innocent casualties. And by that measure, which is the measure that our opponents use, which is no context whatsoever, circumstances don't matter, then yes, then Israel is on its way to perdition. But if you factor in the circumstances, I mean, I'm as you know, I support the principle. I emphasize the principle of ending Israel's rule over the Palestinian people. I think it's a disaster for us, but I also believe that we don't have any safe way out of this predicament, and our tragedy is that our most basic security is tied to a policy that is immoral in absolute terms. It is immoral for one people to rule over another and deprive it of its rights. The only way that that becomes essential is if that other people intends to try to destroy you, to try to deprive you of your national rights. And that's our situation with the Palestinians. And in terms of our asymmetrical wars in Gaza, in Lebanon, to some extent in the past in Syria, what that means in its context is that we are fighting an enemy that is determined to destroy us, that has already proven that it's serious about its genocidal intentions in microcosm. October 7th was a kind of a micro pre-enactment of the Hamas charter. And we're fighting under conditions that no army has had to deal with. hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. Every other house is booby trapped. And so when you factor all of this together, then you need to start judging. Then you need to say, okay, I understand. Now let's look at what Israel does and doesn't do. Now, I have my criticisms on both fronts, both in Judea and Samaria. You mentioned settlement violence. I think that that is a scandal for the Jewish people of historic proportions. The fact that we have allowed, and however the extent of it is, I believe the extent is more or less what's being reported. And I take the words of those who are engaged in this at face value. They're very proud of what they're doing, and there is an agenda to systematically uproot Palestinians. That's clear from. Look, we know what the far right believes, and this is the beginning of an attempt to implement the Kahanist vision. Now, the real scandal here is not the rioters. The real scandal is the government, which has tied the hands of the army. The army wants to act, and it has not allowed the army to fully engage. And this is something that there is no way to squirm out of this. The judgment on Israel, our own judgment on ourselves, this situation is indefensible. And so, and in terms of Gaza, I think the picture there is much more complicated, as I tried to lay out. I do think there are questions we need to raise about whether the extent of the devastation was necessary. And I'm saying questions. We need to have that conversation. And right now, the problem in Jewish discourse is that one side has already declared us guilty, the Jewish left, and the other side, the Jewish right, says there's nothing to talk about. We acted in self-defense. Look at October 7th. End of story. Now, that can't be the end of story. We are a people that has carried a moral rigorousness from the beginning. We were founded by Avraham Avinu, who dared to question whether God was being faithful to his own moral standards. I'm talking, of course, about stone. And so that's imprinted in us. And I would put it this way, Scott, just to take a step back and to really try to understand the dilemma that we're facing as a people. We are carrying two basic identities as a people. The first is what I mentioned, is that we are the children of Avraham Avinu. We are Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, as Jews used to call ourselves, merciful children of merciful parents. And we have carried this tradition for 4,000 years. The second identity that we carry is that we are history's most hated and hunted people. And for the period of the 2,000 years of exile, these two identities were in harmony. But once you transition to power, and you have the responsibility of power in very complicated moral situations, you find suddenly that these two seminal identities, these two identities really help define us as a people. They now come into tension, if not overt conflict. And that's what makes this moment so wrenching for the Jewish people and why we're so divided. Because one part is saying, wait a minute, Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, you're just going to throw that out the window? And the other side is saying, yeah, but 80 years after the Holocaust, we're dealing with an October 7th, and we're the most hated country in the world by far. And they're both right. They're both right.
That is a very difficult thing to think about and to consider, but obviously essentially true in terms of who we are. But that leads me, Yossi, to one of the big questions that I've been challenged by good friends of mine, people I care about deeply, who will say, Even well-founded criticism of the state of Israel in 2026 has to be kept entirely in-house. And by entirely in-house, that means even on a podcast like this, which can be listened to by people outside of the Jewish community, it's dangerous to start engaging in too much introspection publicly, because there are people out there who will take everything that we say and will use it against us. I don't agree with that perspective, but I understand the fear.
The only time we can have an honest conversation in shul or in Kiddush, that's the framework. Look, I understand the fear to an extent, but there's a problem here, and that is that we're hemorrhaging support. Never mind the people who hate us. I don't care about them. I don't care about their critiques. I owe them nothing. I owe them no moral accountability. But I do owe my friends a moral accountability. And we still have more friends than we often realize. And I certainly owe my fellow Jews in the diaspora an accountability. And I'm not talking about those who have joined the other side. I'm not talking about the Jewish anti-Zionists. I'm talking about those who are going through a profound crisis of faith and connection with Israel. Now, I think that crisis is I think they're exaggerating the need for that crisis, but the crisis is real and we need to deal with it and respect it. And so when I talk about a Jewish self-reckoning, the more that we can hold on to our moral credibility as a Jewish state, the more we'll be able to hold on to those people who want to continue supporting us. I get emails from friends, from people I don't know, who are saying, "Tell me something I can hold on to. Tell me something I can push back with. What's the hope here?" And look, people, who aren't going, Jews on the right, say, who are not going through this moral crisis, really can't understand just how acute it is. And to dismiss this as a betrayal of Israel is too easy. And there are people who have been in lifelong passionate relationship with Israel who are asking themselves this question, and I have to take that seriously. I have to deal with it.
I just feel sometimes that one of the questions that needs to be asked, now I'm coming from the other side, which is that when we have those people who delegitimize Israel's actions, as you say, it's questions, not declarations. The question needs to be asked, what would you have Israel do instead? In full context. In other words, It could be when people say what Israel's doing in Gaza is not okay. Okay, I can accept that if you tell me what it should have done instead that will protect the people.
Absolutely. And we never hear an alternative idea. And I've asked that question. I've raised it certainly many times, and I've never gotten a remotely satisfactory answer. That does not absolve us, those of us who have a fair idea of what we're up against and what the IDF is in its nature and who we are as a people. That doesn't absolve us from asking some difficult questions. Did things go wrong on the ground in a way that we've never seen before? And by that I mean, was there a breakdown in discipline in the Army's basic code of ethics? And I certainly don't mean across the board, and I definitely don't mean from the upper echelons. But on the ground, were there officers who turned a blind eye to certain actions that should never have happened? And every war anywhere, and every one of Israel's wars has produced war crimes that are committed by deviants, individuals who for whatever reason break the Army's code of ethics. The question, or the two questions that are raised by deviant actions is A, how widespread are they? And B, does the army take active measures to try to curtail the deviance and to investigate itself? And when I talk about questions, and again, I'm emphasizing they still are questions for me, but they're increasingly urgent questions. I'm not sure that I know the answers. And I'm not sure that I have satisfactory answers to those two questions. So I also have very concrete examples where we failed miserably in the last few years. For example, the food distribution, when we took over the distribution in March 2025, I think it was. It's all a blur. These really
Right.
the last 3 years are just one big blur.
Yeah.
The question there was, for me, why were soldiers so ill prepared to deal with thousands of desperate people converging on the food distribution points that they had no choice? And here I'm not faulting the soldiers. They had no choice but to open fire into crowds because it was a terrifying scene of crowds running toward either the food distribution or to the soldiers. And so you're a soldier standing there. You have no choice. My question is, why weren't they prepared? Why didn't they have riot control equipment? When the government saw where this was going, why didn't it immediately stop? Eventually it had to, but it should have stopped this within the first few days. So that's just one example. And look, it's very hard, obviously. It's very hard for us to raise these questions when we are being assaulted by a lynch mob that's accusing us of the most outrageous crimes that we know we haven't committed. And so how do you, in that kind of atmosphere, how do you remain true to your own moral tradition by asking yourselves difficult questions? Now, there's also a very practical aspect to this. And I mentioned one practical reason for having a serious moral conversation, and that is the need to signal to our friends that we still are a morally credible society. But there's also the very real issue of keeping the Jewish people together, and that depends certainly for liberal Jews in the diaspora, but also liberal Jews in Israel who send their children to the army. We need the assurance that Tzahal is still Tzahal, and that we haven't become a militia. And there are elements in Israeli society, and we know them, we live with them, who would turn Tzahal into a militia. And that, for me, is the beginning of the end of, God forbid, the unraveling of the Israeli consensus around Tzahal.
But Yossi, that's exactly the question that so many people have, and I include myself in that, which is that I want to have a moral reckoning. And I certainly do not pretend that Tzahal is infallible. That would be absurd. As you said, every war has war crimes committed by deviants. It's human nature. And at the same time, because the world, quote unquote, has only eyes for one particular war and knows nothing about warfare in general. What they know about war, they probably get from Marvel movies.
Right.
They don't know anything. And therefore, when we say that, for example, the food distribution program was a failure in some ways, Tzahal messed up or whatever, they don't hear, wow, that's a moral reckoning. That is trying to fix the problems. Instead, they hear the only army that ever made such a big mistake is Tzahal. It's absurd, and that's what people hear. I still don't know how to walk the line so that we have the moral reckoning, that we make sure that we remain Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, and at the same time, don't give fodder to the people who want to delegitimize us, and they will use that.
So broadly speaking, there are three categories of people that we're talking about here. There are those who have made up their minds and see us as a genocidal Nazi state. And there is no, obviously, there's no dialogue there. Um, it doesn't interest me to try to persuade them. It's a waste of time. There are on the other extreme, there are our friends and well-wishers who are increasingly concerned and depressed by what they perceive to be happening, some of which is true and some of which is not. And then there's the large middle, which doesn't really know one way or another. It's influenced by the last few years of relentless media images and slanted reporting. But and I don't know how to reach that middle, frankly. I thought that I used to. I thought that I was once writing for our friends and for those who are confused. I don't know anymore how to write for anyone except our friends. But I feel that that in itself is become an important responsibility because if we continue to lose the support of our friends, then we're really on our way to a very bad place.
Let's move on to talking a little bit about religious Zionism. We referred before to Smotrich, and I talked about Ben-Gvir for a few moments. However one defines religious Zionism, I think that today, Yossi, it has drastically changed from what it once meant. And this has been a process that's been going on for decades. But today, at least on a political level, when one talks about religious Zionism, it is directly associated with what I would call an extremist political philosophy along with its own religious philosophy. And religious Zionism, once upon a time, was very much not like that. I don't know if we would call it a big tent, but certainly it included different people who had different ideas that are not similar to the inheritors of Gush Emunim. For example, the old Rav Reinus type of religious Zionism, or the Rav Soloveitchik or Rav Amital religious Zionism. Not that that was necessarily dominant over the past 50 years, but it was a serious voice within it. And even within the Gush Emunim, it seems to be moving in a certain direction. I would say myself that Ben-Gvir 15 years ago, maybe even less, would have been completely anathema to many people in the religious Zionist camp. And today, it is not for those same people, at least for many of them. And I'd like to know what you see as the future of religious Zionism. Is there any turning back? Is there a way for someone like me who identifies as a religious Zionist, but not on the political level at all? For me, religious Zionism means something drastically different. I think back to Michael Oren's book about the Six-Day War, and I remember reading when Israel was debating the government, the labor government during the Six-Day War, trying to debate whether or not to respond to Jordan's attacks on Jerusalem. And should they invade the West Bank? And the main naysayers were the religious Zionists. It was the Dati-Leumi party, the Mafdal. They were the ones who at that time were kind of leftist.
Along with Mapam, the Marxist Zionist party. Yeah, yeah, an alliance that's just inconceivable today.
Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily correct or incorrect, but my point is that it's nice to have a big tent in my mind, and I wish that were still true. And by the way, in case I'm not being clear, it's not that I don't want Gush Emunim to be part of religious Zionism. I very much want that voice to be part of it, but I want it to be multivocal, not univocal. Is there a way to retrieve that once again?
So if we go back to the period immediately after the Six-Day War, there's a seminal moment which I never fully appreciated until recently, and that is Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook's pronouncement that no government of Israel has the authority to give back land. And that's an extraordinary statement. The most important religious Zionist theologian of his time, and I think really of the last 50 years, made a statement that effectively annulled the legitimacy of the secular democratic state to function as a secular state on this particular issue. Then you have the Chaydalim, you have a whole subset who are more radical and extend that denial of authority to the state on all kinds of other issues. But the root is there. It's with Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook's pronouncement, and that pains me very much because I love him, and in some ways, I revere him. But this is to my mind, this is the foundation of the beginning of the nullification of the old religious Zionism, which accepted the authority of the secular state as the only way to hold the Jewish people together, as the only way to protect the Jewish people. We don't have anything better. There's no Sanhedrin. There's not going to be a substitute anytime in the foreseeable future. Ze ma yesh, as we say here. This is what we've got. And so you cherish what you have. You cherish the miracle of what you have, and you do everything you can to preserve it. This is the first crack, Rav Tzvi Yehuda's pronouncement. And then it gets progressively wider with successive decades. And so I don't know how to answer your question. I think that in some ways, it may be the most important question facing Israeli society, because there is no Israel without religious Zionism. And I wouldn't say the same about the Haredi world, tragically. You could excise the entire Haredi world and move it abroad, and the state of Israel will continue. And I say that with tremendous pain, because that's their choice to separate themselves from being indispensable to the state. And I'm not saying that there wouldn't be all kinds of tragic repercussions if, God forbid, there was a mass Haredi exodus from the state. And I insist on repeating, God forbid. But it wouldn't affect the basic intactness of Israeli society. But there is no Israeli society without religious Zionism. There's no Tzahal without religious Zionism today. And so where the religious Zionist community goes is where Israel goes. Leave aside, whether it becomes more moderate, less moderate on political issues. That's almost secondary to the question of how it expresses its politics, and whether it sees common ground with those parts of Israeli society that disagree with its politics, and whether it still sees itself as the bridge. Religious Zionism always spoke about the makaf, the hyphen, right? Religious Zionism, between religion and Zionism. And religious Zionists always said, we can pray with the Haredim, and we can serve in the army with Chilonim, with seculars. Yes, I suppose that's still true, but there are growing elements within religious Zionism that are stretching the hyphen to the breaking point.
Given that, let me ask you a question in general, not about religious Zionism alone, but in general. Someone who says, I still believe in a Jewish state, but I no longer know what we're trying to build here. What is this thing we're trying to build? What is the vision that animates the Zionist project today? Would you have an answer for that person?
So if you look at the different stages of the history of Zionism, the history of Israel, we went through the first foundational stage of building a secular, socialist, Zionist state that was going to substantially break from Jewish tradition, from the Jewish past. Not completely. Ben-Gurion never envisioned a complete break from let's not call it Judaism, but Jewishness. And labor Zionism was always deeply ambivalent about its relationship to Jewishness. In some ways, it was in an act of rebellion. In other ways, it had a kind of a soft spot for certain aspects of even Judaism. And that first phase, which lasted until 1977, the rise of the Likud, laid the foundations and created the Jewish state. And I think, by the way, parenthetically, I think that the crisis for the Orthodox community, which has never really been fully addressed, it seems to me, is why God entrusted that part of the Jewish people that was in open rebellion against Judaism with the success story of the ingathering of the exiles and the re-empowerment of the Jewish people. That's a theological challenge to some basic premises of the Orthodox community. I would add, in addition, that the Orthodox community needs to ask itself a further question, which is, why is it that when we finally had a de facto Orthodox government, and this government, it was not Orthodox officially, but in everything but name, this was an Orthodox government.
I believe the majority of the government actually is Chovshei Kippah.
A majority of its Knesset members, not only cabinet ministers, are religious. The agenda of this government was almost completely religious. And yet, how is it that this government was the worst failure in Israel's history? This, I think, is also, it's a really important, maybe almost a theological question. How is it that when the Orthodox community finally came to power, it brought us October 7th, it brought us the deepest divisions in Israel's history, it brought us growing emigration to an extent that we haven't seen for decades, maybe not since the 50s and 60s. And God forbid that seems to be growing. How is that possible? So these are questions. So you didn't ask me this, Scott, but I have to say this, and especially have to say this to an Orthodox audience. How is it that the secular, the fry, were the ones who brought us the state, who brought us the 6-Day War, who brought us back to the Kotel and Marat HaMachpelah. They did that. And this Orthodox government nearly lost it all. How's that possible? So, questions. Now, I don't remember what question you actually...
You don't have an answer, I assume.
I don't have an answer, but I think that...
Can I give you my answer, which is not an answer, but a response?
Yeah.
My response is that we have to remember, as religious Jews, that when the great prophets spoke to people, they were talking to religious people. The people who were over the Avodah Zarah didn't care what Yeshayahu said. But the people who cared about God and Torah were the ones he was talking to. They were the people he was complaining about. And there's a certain self-satisfaction that I believe religious Jews too often exhibit. A self-satisfaction that we are doing the right thing without enough true self-criticism. I don't mean that our entire understanding of Torah mitzvot is necessarily mistaken, but we often look at small things. We look at small details. I remember, to give a very tiny example, which has nothing to do with this, years ago when I was running a yeshiva, one of the teachers there said there is a kenes, an assembly in Yerushalayim, that's there to talk about the importance of saying Amen properly. And should we bring the yeshiva there? And I laughed. I said, exactly, because saying Amen or not saying Amen is the biggest problem facing Klal Yisrael today. Now, I have no problem with trying to improve our ability to say Amen. It also can be an attempt or a way of avoiding the real issues that we have to look at because we don't want to look at them. Too often, I think religious people, and I'm speaking as a religious person, have blinders on. We have to start really doing serious introspection. That's my response to that.
No, I appreciate that very much. I think that there's a certain triumphalism that's set in to different parts of the religious community. The religious Zionists experienced this triumphalism after 67. The Haredim experienced it, I think, after the Yom Kippur War, when you had the first big wave of Chozrim B'Tshuvah, of secularists entering the Haredi world, including some very prominent actors and pilots, and there and the Orthodox communities began to feel this is our moment. We are now regaining our preeminence that we lost over the 150 years of Haskalah, of the mass defection of Jews from Orthodoxy. And, I grew up in the Orthodox world of the 1960s and 70s in Borough Park, which at that time not yet fully Haredi. It was a mixture of, we were a religious Zionist family, and Borough Park was becoming, of course, heavily Haredi, but you still had a strong religious Zionist minority. And I remember first of all the easy interaction between these two communities, which today is almost inconceivable. And I also remember a softness in the Orthodox world. This was a community that was living the trauma in the most immediate way. It was the Orthodox community was one of the hardest hit in the Shoah. The only community that I think was harder hit than the Orthodox was actually the Bund, which was erased by the Shoah. And there was this sense in the Orthodox community of a kind of certainly a great tolerance for religious deviation. And there was a very practical reason for that. And that is that many of the survivors who were living religious lives, and I include my father in that, weren't believers. They'd lost their faith in the war, and they were going through the motions. My parents' friends, who later became very prominent in Satmar and other Hasidic courts, when you would speak to them, did they really have strong faith in those years? That's not my memory at all. I remember davening in a shtibel, in a Haredi synagogue that was very closely aligned to Satmar. And I remember nobody davening except the Rebbe. It's like that was his job, to be the official religious Jew. And so I'm saying all this because something was lost as the Orthodox community began to recover and began to really feel not only a sense of healing, but of power. It lost that tenderness that I remember, that ability to hold contradictions, and an ability to just say, okay, we're all Jews, we all went through this, and every Jew could have been there, and we've lost the survivor consciousness. We have it still in terms of how we react to outside threat, but we've lost the survivor consciousness internally, how we relate to each other, and that is very, very painful.
Well, that ability to live with paradox, to live with contradictions, and to hold both at the same time, you're presenting it now, Yossi, as some sort of practical reality that they had to live with, and that's a good thing. But I think it's also, myself, a theological necessity. We as human beings with finite intelligence cannot understand the divine in its full splendor, obviously, and thinking that we can is a theological monstrosity.
Well, this is an occupational hazard of all religious people in all religions, is imposing whatever insights we have about God onto God, who actually is greater than whatever our very limited understanding is. And and I see this in the Haredi world over and over again. This preternatural ability to know exactly what God is doing at any given time. And if, God forbid, something happens, a tragedy happens to secular Israelis, well, the answer is, well, of course, look at what they're doing. October 7th, and we heard this in the Haredi world. Why did October 7th happen? Well, look at the Nova, Simchat Torah, and they're dancing, and there's a Buddha there. And so what do you expect? But when something terrible happens, God forbid, to Haredim, whose fault is it? It's also the secularists. Why did the Shoah happen? Which nearly wiped out the Haredi world? Well, because of the Jews in Germany who were assimilating. So you have all bases covered at all times, no matter what happens. It's always another Jew's fault. And I marvel at that extraordinary capacity of Haredim to really know God's will and to have all the answers all the time.
It sounds nice, even if I find it theologically shallow, to say the least.
Scott, I was being a little sarcastic there at the end.
I figured you were, yes. I know. When you're trying to understand something controversial, a complex event in Israel, going back to our main topic today, and trying to understand what's really happening over there, do you have a way of figuring out how you trust somebody, whom you should trust, what to trust, what voices, sources, or principles help you to discern what's really happening? I say this when we talked before about, for example, violence in Judea and Samaria. And you said you, by and large, believe what the media say. I'm curious how you decide who's saying the truth in a world where everybody has an opinion and very few people present hard facts.
Yeah, I don't look for news in the foreign media for my news on Israel, and I certainly don't look to the New York Times. Uh, I read the Times primarily for the op-ed. I feel I need to know what's being said, especially about us. And I get my news from Israeli sources. I rely on the Times of Israel. I rely on Ynet. I'd say that those are really my two main sources. And I have certain journalists that I depend on. Ron Ben Yishai. I depend on Yossi Werter. I depend on the whole staff of the Times of Israel. And so, there are people that I read and have read for years and know that they may not always be right, but they try to get to the truth. And that's all you can expect from a journalist. That they're going to get it wrong. And I speak as someone who used to be a journalist. And a journalist's job is not to discover the truth; it's to strive for the truth, no matter what, and let the chips fall where they may. And of course, where journalism went wrong, and it went wrong in my generation, and I saw it in journalism school. I saw it already among my peers, was the shift from seeing journalism as the quest, however imperfectly, for truth to the quest for justice. And as soon as you are confusing the role of a journalist with the role of an NGO activist, you are going to destroy journalism. And we've seen that happen tragically to this generation of journalists. And there is no effective democracy without a trustworthy media. I think that in Israel, to some extent, we still have a trustworthy media, but there's been an erosion, definitely. But it's still better, I think, than what I see in some other places.
Here is a bonus question for members of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Now, Yossi, you've devoted much of your life to interfaith dialogue. In fact, before we went on the air, I told you that one of my favorite books is your book from probably about 25 years ago at this point. I think it was right before 9/11 that it came out, At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, which was a wonderful book about your, I'll call them adventures, in talking to religious Christians and Muslims, some who like Jews and some who may have ambivalence towards them. And I found it to be a very inspiring book. I'd like to know in general if your conversations have changed your understanding of Judaism per se, or if it's mainly changed your understanding of other faiths. What has been the reaction? What has been the way you've imbibed that kind of encounter? To hear Yossi's answer, become a member of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Yossi goes in a direction I found especially meaningful as he reflects on what encounters with deeply religious Christians and Muslims taught him about religious humility and about his own Jewish practice. He also explains how those experiences changed the way he thinks about prayer, faith, and placing God at the center of religious life. Join Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. The link is in the description of this podcast. Today, Israel's facing, as we mentioned, these internal divisions that are very profound. And you said at the very beginning of our conversation how on October 7th, it gave you paradoxically a sense of hope, how everyone came back together. And of course, today, we do see to some degree the unraveling of that initial sense of unity. Do you think that there is a chance for an opportunity, something that can bring people together, a new way of developing a shared purpose in such a polarized society? And let me also say, polarization seems to be not unique to the Israeli project. Every country seems in the West becoming more and more polarized. We see this in the United States as well. The big middle, the center seems to be disappearing everywhere. Are there opportunities for rebuilding a broad sense of shared purpose in Israel today?
So I'm really glad you raised the question because it brings us back to an earlier question, which I started to answer and then didn't, which was, is there a vision? Can there be a vision? And so I started by saying, well, at the initial uh, impelling vision of Zionism was for a majority of Zionists was socialist Zionism. Of course, there was the minority, the revisionist Zionists, which is the camp I grew up in. I was in Beitar, and that was always and that's emotionally, it's still where I locate myself historically in that debate, even though politically I'm not there anymore. But the next wave of the next vision that took over official Israel was the settlement movement. The kibbutz, which represented the it was the embodiment of socialist Israel. Then the settlement took over and really replaced the kibbutz as the pioneering ethos and the avant-garde of Zionism. And I think we are now entering the third stage, because just as the kibbutz failed to unite, couldn't sustain uniting Israel, the settlements have not united Israel. And I remember at the beginning of the settlement movement, and I was very interested and to some extent drawn to the settlement movement in those early years. I remember the language that was said. We're going to unite Am Yisrael. I remember Hebron. What is Hebron? Kol Yisrael Chaverim. Hebron makes the whole Jewish people friends. Well, it has not played out that way. If there's any place that's more divisive within the Jewish people as a whole, it's Hebron. And so the settlement movement did not succeed. It succeeded in other ways. It did not succeed by any means in giving us a shared vision. And so the question is, what's next? And my sense, maybe my hope more than a sense, is that the next stage of the next vision that we need desperately, especially after these last years of shattering, is to own kibbutz galuyot in a deep way. And kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. And by owning kibbutz galuyot, I mean accepting the fact that no one part of Israeli society can determine the totality of the Israeli ethos. Labor Zionism tried to do that and failed. Religious Zionism in its settlement incarnation tried to do that and failed. No one can determine the totality of the Israeli ethos, because the logic of kibbutz galuyot is that we have brought all of our contradictory ideas of who we are as a people, what we've learned through 2,000 years of wandering, what is a Jewish state. We've brought all of those ideas back home with us. And the only way we're going to make it here is if we figure out ways of accommodating these different parts of Israel. I don't know how to do that, but for me, that's the vision. And it's a vision of wholeness. And in that sense, for me, as a religious Jew, it's a messianic vision. That's the messianic vision of the Jewish people learning to live with itself, learning to accept its brokenness, its fragmentation, and not to try to artificially impose some unified idea, but to accept the brokenness from the bottom up and say, okay, here we are in this 2x4 little country, this hothouse, under this pressure cooker. How are we going to survive here? How are we going to accommodate each other? And so, for example, I would say it begins with how we speak about each other. Now, as you heard, I have a very a deep disagreement with the Haredim. It's a political disagreement. It's a sociological disagreement. It's a theological disagreement. But at the same time, I am forbidden to use language that delegitimizes the Haredi community, that downplays the tremendous sacrifices that they make to maintain their community and the miracle of the Haredi rebirth, which I saw happen it began in the 1960s. It began, in places like Borough Park. And so I would not use the language of mishtantim when I speak. The Haredim are not shirkers. They're separatists, which I think is a historic tragedy for the Jewish people. But to call Haredim shirkers is to imply that there's something lazy about them, that the Haredi community is the only community within the state of Israel that has accepted voluntary poverty for the sake of an ideal. It used to be the kibbutznikim who did that. And in the early years, the settlement movement did that too, when you had people living in trailers in what was just the bare bones of a settlement. And now it's the Haredim. It's still the Haredim. And so that's just an example of we need to begin by speaking with a language that, first of all, accepts the fact that we are all here to stay. Tel Aviv isn't going anywhere, and Bnei Brak isn't going anywhere, and Gush Etzion isn't going anywhere. No one is going anywhere. I would also throw in the Arab Israelis aren't going anywhere. We have to figure out what it means to have 20% of our population that's Israeli and non-Jewish. So this is the question. And when I say the ingathering of the exiles, it's very important for me to add the Arab Israelis, because obviously they're not part of our ingathering. They're not part of Israel as a Jewish state. They are an essential part of Israel as a democratic state. And if we are what does it mean to be a Jewish and democratic state? What does it mean to be a society of ingathering, while at the same time having a substantial minority that has not been ingathered, that we found them here? And so these are the questions. And we have deferred a serious reckoning with these questions for the last century, for good reasons. We've had one national emergency after another, but today, this is the national emergency. And if there's any blessing that can come out of this terrible government, it's that it has finally forced us into this reckoning.
Okay, well, Yossi, I really appreciate those wise words. The idea that this is the third stage that involves the ingathering of the exiles, kibbutz galiot, and learning how to accept that paradox we said before, living with contradiction, living with difference as something which is not only acceptable, but maybe a positive. That's a message which I could really accept.
It's the spiritual ingathering of the exiles as opposed to the physical ingathering. That's the next stage of kibbutz galiot.
Okay, well, Yossi Klein Halevi, I'm very grateful that you joined me today. It was a long time coming, and it's always wonderful to speak with you, so thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to offer a word of thanks to our Patreon supporters. Patreon functions as a voluntary tip jar for Jewish Coffee House and our family of podcasts. Patreon supporters at all levels, as well as paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, will have access to our upcoming private Q&A sessions. Your support in either place helps sustain thoughtful Jewish conversation. Additional bonus material, including the longer episodes with bonus questions, is available to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. No matter how you choose to support this work, we are deeply grateful. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.